Our next speaker is Boris Kagarlitsky from Russia. A name I know very well, but this is the first occasion I've met the man in person. I had great hopes that he'd be able to persuade Gorbachev with all that lot of his views many years ago. Sadly, we've got something, I think, possibly worse than what existed then. But he's an activist and scholar. He works on peace and human rights, and I think he has a point of view to put to this meeting, which will be helpful to us in understanding what's happening in Russia and neighboring countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd rather prefer to come to Cardiff in a different set of circumstances, given the war which is happening in southeastern Ukraine and the war about which I have to speak to you. But also, there'll be another visit to Cardiff quite soon. Mr. Poroshenko, President of Ukraine, is going to come, and he is a non-NATO leader invited to join the NATO summit. Why is he coming? It's very obvious. He's coming there, on the one hand, to establish more intense, more active military cooperation with Ukraine, though, by the way, it is contrary to Ukrainian constitution, which is a neutral country, according to its constitution, but its neutrality is not respected by the current government. But he's also coming there to, on the one hand, ask for more NATO involvement in the war in Ukraine, and on the other hand, to be used by NATO leaders trying to persuade their colleagues in Eastern Europe to spend more money on military purposes. And by the way, when we're speaking about military expenditure, about these 2%, actually, it is very much a question of cannons of butter in the very literary sense of the word. Because if we were, for example, in Lithuania or Latvia or Slovenia, Slovakia, these countries, I mean, really, these countries are now facing lots and lots of economic problems, and they are facing the consequences of terrible austerity policies. So if they increase military spending, even by, say, 1% or something like that, this is already a serious hit, which will really influence the welfare situation of these countries, which is already quite bad. So in that sense, Ukrainian war, it's not just about Ukraine and Russia. It is about the whole of Europe. And it's about the whole of Europe not only in the sense that there is a threat of escalation and so on, but also this is something which will materially affect societies all over Europe and affect them immediately. So you have to think of that and spread this news quite actively, because this is an important thing to understand in the West. But not only in the West, of course. Another problem here is that in the West, people usually do not understand the scale of the conflict. This is something I have to repeat time and again, and maybe somebody heard me speaking in London or at the rally in Newport, so I'm sorry for repeating myself, but I have to repeat it because it's very, very important that the scale of the conflict is totally underestimated by Western public opinion, and Western media, the big media, consciously works on trying to prevent people learning about the real scale of conflict and destruction. So this is a massive propaganda which is trying to kind of distract our attention from the actual destruction and war happening there, and to speak about relations between Russia and Ukraine, to speak about Russian aggressiveness, to speak about evil Putin, to speak about anything except speaking about what is actually happening around Donetsk and Lugansk now. And this is a real war with tank columns, with hundreds of tanks being involved, with artillery, with the shelling of cities, with bombing raids by Ukrainian Air Force, with about 400,000 people leaving Donetsk as refugees. Only Donetsk, which used to be a city of 1 million inhabitants. Now, the most optimistic calculations, they have about 600,000 at best, maybe less. Maybe it's already much less, because people are leaving, because they cannot leave, in the situation when there is no water for days, there is no electricity because the Ukrainian army is bombing their infrastructure. It's wiping out the infrastructure, including electricity lines, water supplies, railroads, roads, everything. So people are leaving massively. And also in Lugansk, it seems that about half of the population have to leave. So this is a humanitarian disaster, and at the same time it's a great shame that Western powers refused to accept the fact of a humanitarian disaster when it was discussed in the United Nations. This is a shame, and this has to be discussed in the West, and this has to be discussed by the public opinion. Because on the one hand, these people love humanitarian interventions, but they hate speaking about humanitarian disasters when it's not in their interest. So again, we must understand that the level of destruction is really, really terrible. We know that thousands of people were already killed. These were Ukrainian soldiers, these were fighters of the self-defense of southeastern republics, so-called Novorossiya. These are also civilians. And also Ukrainian military forces, the Ukrainian government army, is being defeated by the self-defense forces. By the way, don't believe when they're saying that Russian troops are there. They're not. Of course, let's be honest, there are Russian instructors, there are Russian volunteers. That's true. And there are many of them. But there are also Western instructors, and there are mercenaries, and there are private military agencies there, like Blackwaters. So, but again, every time when the army is being defeated, what they're doing, they're shelling cities. And that is why we have so many civilians killed. There were schools, there were hospitals, there were kindergartens shelled and destroyed. So they're allowing them to leave. When they surrender their weapons, they're free to go. Also, when they take prisoners, they ask them just to sign a letter promising that they will not return there with arms, and then they let them go. So, who are the criminals in this situation? And finally, speaking about the current government in Ukraine and Russia, there is no doubt the Russian government is no model of democracy. We fought against this government. We participated in the protests in 2012. We were involved in struggles in which some of the comrades and friends were repressed, and some of them are under arrest even now. So there are political prisoners in Russia. My own home was searched a year ago. So that says we are no great friends of Putin government. Everybody knows that. But we also must understand that about a year ago, Ukraine was considered to be a country much more democratic than Russia. They didn't have political prisoners, for example. Unlike Russia, which had political prisoners. They didn't have political prisoners except maybe Yulia Tymoshenko, who was a former prime minister and who was a kind of victim of a power struggle in Ukraine. But they didn't have ordinary people as political prisoners. Now, with the current regime, they have hundreds of political prisoners. And they already have hundreds of people who were killed by death squads in Ukraine. So in that sense, the situation reversed. So today, it is Ukraine which is becoming more and more a problem in terms of human rights. It is the Ukrainian government which is repressing its own people. And one of the reasons why the Ukrainian government is so aggressive in the southeast is because they know that the support inside the rest of the country is also very weak. And they know that there will be more and more protests, there will be more and more resistance, also because of the austerity policies they're carrying out. Because it's a package. It's not just more military spending, it's not just orientation towards West, it's also more austerity, more cuts, more job losses. It all comes together. It's just one package which the West offers, together with the IMF credits which go into the pockets of the elite. So this is exactly what people in southeastern Ukraine are fighting against. But it's not just southeastern Ukraine, it's all over Ukraine. And that's also the issue for Russia. It's also the issue for the West. And it's the issue for all of us. That's what we should fight for. Thank you.